The Northwest Ordinance had abolished slavery. So what began to, it seemed to be happening, and hopefully you understand this language, was that slavery seemed like it was going to die out. And I'm going to go over why it seemed like it was going to die out. And perhaps the irony of this invention of this cotton gin is so strongly seen when you consider that this thing was no longer going to continue to be an American institution. In the past, the planters had written about slavery as being a necessary evil, a wrong. Now they wrote about it and still did it, so some might consider this, hypocrisy. But regardless, there was a sense that slavery was inconsistent with the values of what America was founded on. Our country was founded on principles of all men are created equal, and then clearly holding people in bondage was not that. So it looked like slavery was on the way out. And by that, I mean, not only were people talking about slavery not being a good thing, they were using the language necessary evil, but it was no longer very economically viable. And that's something I really want to draw attention to. It was no longer profitable. And so I've got, first of all, some stats, some just quotes here for you to absorb some of our key founders who had openly, or at least in writing, spoken against slavery, most notably Benjamin Franklin, who would become an actual abolitionist before he passed away. But here you see John Adams calling Negro slavery an evil. Benjamin Rush, one of the signers of the Declaration, an offspring of slavery, was not intended by God. This is not God's will. Okay, it's so foreign from what humans should be doing. Hamilton says we hold a Bill of Rights in one hand and whip slaves with the other hand. So it's pretty clear, and even Jefferson is going to use less loaded language, but language that says that this is inconsistent with the ideals of the American body politic, inconsistent with freedom. But that's not the reason it's going to die. As much as we'd like to look at that and say, well, that's the reason it's going out. The reason it's going out is plainly economic. If you look here, slave imports had pretty much almost ceased to exist. And the crops that were produced by slaves historically, tobacco, rice, and indigo, had plateaued and were not creating enough income, enough wealth to pay for the upkeep, maintenance, and long-term security of slaves. And I know that sounds weird, but a lot of times we forget that, when someone owned a slave, that's a terrible thing. But when they did, they owned them for life, which meant, for lack of a better expression, at certain points, slaves no longer became particularly economically profitable, no longer viable. And so what plantation owners here in Virginia were recognizing is that it might actually be more profitable in the upper South. Keep in mind, this is the upper South, to shift away from a lot of tobacco and go more towards wheat and corn, which did not require an intense slave labor force. Of course, you still had some Southerners. George Mason was calling it evil. Thomas Jefferson was denouncing it. Alexis de Tocqueville talked about people in the South are talking about abolishing slavery, contriving other means of farming. So one of the things I want to point out before we go any further on that is, why didn't they end it before 1793? And here's part of the problem. Part of the problem, and this is Jefferson's writing. Jefferson says, look, we have this wolf by the ears, and by that he means slavery. We don't want to continue to hold on to the wolf, but if we let him go, what will happen? We will be destroyed. And this is very interesting, because at the end of the argument for Southerners, even Southerners who saw slavery as immoral, they could not envision, and this is what his second quote here is, nothing is more certainly written in the book of fate than that these people, if these people are to be free, nor is it less certain that these two races cannot live in the same government. Nature, habit, opinion have drawn lines of distinction between them. So what this means is Jefferson, in all of his wisdom, cannot envision an American society where African Americans coexist with non-African Americans, white Americans. And so they, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, these Southern slaveholders who have been around slaves their whole lives, they know that it's not right, but they don't know how to end it without it threatening their own self-preservation, both economic self-preservation, but also this sort of bizarre, in their minds, bizarre idea of a biracial society. They can't visualize what America has become today, which is a multiracial society, much less a biracial. So I will give you a little heads up here. Jefferson and one of his lieutenants, James Monroe, President Monroe, are going to land on an idea that will become the first type of abolitionism in America. And so I'll just throw this out to you as a question. Does anybody know what became the solution in the minds of men like Jefferson and James Monroe, Madison and Monroe? Like, if you're going to end slavery, how do you resolve this, as they perceive, impossibility of having two races living together in one society? How do they resolve
people back to Africa?
Okay, yeah. Now, and again, that is absolutely the common way to hear it. Nicholas is correct. But the phraseology I'd like you to amend that with is not to use the word back. In other words, ship these people to Africa. And the reason is that these are third and fourth generation African Americans. You wouldn't be shipping them back to anywhere any more than you would be shipping me back to France. But you know, in their minds, that is exactly the solution: is colonization. It's sending African Americans who are free to Western Africa. And as a result of that, your very first abolitionist society that's not of the Quaker variety is called the American Colonization Society. And their goal is to colonize freed Africans to a place that we now call Liberia. And its capital will be named after the president of that time in America, James Monroe, Monrovia. So that is their solution. Although the problem is, as you might understand, these are not Africans. These are not people who want to live in Africa. These are people who consider themselves Americans. They want to live in America as free, equal people in America. And that for Jefferson and Monroe is just a bridge too far. I'll tell you, the popularity of the idea of colonization does not go away. Even as late as the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln is considering this as a possibility. So understanding how far we've come as a society today is crucial to recognize that, you know, both this group of founders here who condemn slavery, as they should, and these founders who sort of call it, you know, the necessary evil or the evil we have to live with, could not envision a future America where African Americans and white Americans were equal. So that's a fundamental change in the philosophy of really race here in America. And you can see why it was such a struggle. It has been such a struggle in the 20th century. Okay, so as you mentioned, Christopher, accurately, the overwhelming change that occurred is Eli Whitney's development, his manufacture of, and then of course the subsequent copying of this machine is quite simple to manufacture, and so lots and lots of people made them. And what it did is it created the success for short staple cotton to grow throughout the South and not just along the coast, and really just transform the entire future of our country. So you're absolutely right. Be sure to know Eli Whitney, and that would be, of course, number 2 on your study guide. The end of slavery was premature, because now slavery is going to explode in demand and in numbers. And so we're going to take a look at it. And here's an example of how quickly that changed, because if you come back up here, this is John Quincy Adams talking about the Missouri Compromise. Okay. John Quincy Adams, by this point, was a congressman. He was no longer president. No, excuse me, this was before he was president, but he would be a congressman later. But he said, if the Union must be dissolved, slavery is the question upon which it will break. And he's talking about this debate over the spread of slavery. So I want to make sure you understand that the Missouri Compromise, 1820, right, is only 27 years after the development of the Cotton Gin. But what it should tell you is that these states here in the southern deep South have already begun to, quote, fill up rapidly with people who have migrated there to grow cotton. And that's also true for Louisiana. And it's also true for Texas. If you remember, this is a period when Texas was being settled by the Alstons. And so we do not look at the upper South, these sort of original southern states here, as slave cotton kingdom states. Well, of course, they were slave states that had already existed, but this rapid spread of slavery is going to be propelled by cotton. Okay, so let's take a look at how important cotton will become, not only to the Southern economy, but ultimately to the national economy and even the global economy. So here is where short staple cotton, short fiber cotton grows, right here. Today we would look back in this yellow area and call this the Cotton Kingdom. As you can imagine, this is a very perfectly suited climate and soil for the growth of this commodity. Okay, you'll notice that the upper South has virtually none of that. A little bit here in central Piedmont, North Carolina, and just a little bit here in Eastern Virginia. But again, tobacco kind of on the way down a little bit. You'll notice by the Civil War, corn had become a much more sort of common grown commodity here. Okay, different type of tobacco grown in this part of America and our part than grown out here as well. Just any future tobacco magnates in the community. We have a bright leaf tobacco, which is distinctive. You'll notice there was some iron ore, but overwhelmingly the product for the Deep South is going to be cotton. Okay, I chose to put this picture here in the so-called Cotton Kingdom, and hope that you recognize that this is not at all accurate. This is one of those lithographs. You might remember me talking about those postcards kind of thing that circulated. This is a Currier and Ives lithograph to kind of depict the Southern Odyssey. What happened is Northerners would, from time to time, would take a Southern trip. You know, they would take a ride on a steamboat down the Mississippi, or they would, go on a tour. This is what Eli Whitney was doing, for example. And here you see a sort of pastoral life of a cotton plantation. You see like a dog resting in the shade of the wagon here. This fella riding on the back, kind of chilling. Everybody seems just happy, and back in the distance, there's a guy riding on a horse, but he doesn't appear to be cracking the whip or doing that. So again, this is the image of slavery that the South certainly wants to project, but also the North feels more comfortable with, because the Northern economy is going to become utterly dependent on this too for a period of time. So here you see again, very rapidly, an explosion. I mean, I've got multiple graphics here to show you how deeply embedded the cotton kingdom will be here in these deep southern states. Okay, so lots and lots of art, pictures, drawings, and if you don't understand the value of the cotton plant, just try to imagine like what textiles would have existed like prior to this. Cotton would have been on the same sort of scale as silk, very rare. And so this is going to allow just millions and millions of tons of cotton to be generated in relative ease for the landowner, not so much for obviously the laborer. It's a brutally hot job. If you've never picked cotton, the lint is stuck in sort of it's like a claw almost. So when you pick it, it can slice your fingers. They would weigh, the slave drivers would weigh how much cotton you picked per day. If you did not meet the quota that you were supposed to, they would whip you hard, really beat you. They would deprive you of things. So life in the Southern plantation was far more difficult. Not to say that any slave life was good, but the Southern life, it was just work you almost until you were dead. So here is the impact of the Cotton Kingdom. And I need you to understand that if you're thinking about New England, New England's cotton is from the South. So you cannot have Lowell mills, you cannot have the Slater mills without Southern cotton. It's just, that's how it worked. There are a few other places in the world that are producing cotton at this point, Egypt being one, India being another, but both are not nearly as on the scale of the South. The South, as you can see here, is producing over 2/3, almost 3/4 of the world's cotton. So that's from one part of our country. And of course, the factories of England were just loading up on this cotton. You can see here in a fairly brief amount of time, the amount of tonnage of cotton that was produced, 18 million pounds exported to a billion, 1,000 million is a billion pounds of cotton. So that's just an extraordinary amount. And the mammoth value of it, you're talking about $5 million versus $191 million in a fairly rapid amount of time. So again, do make note that over half of all of American exports is cotton. half of all American exports in North and South is coming out of the South. Okay, so you cannot overstate the value of cotton on the Southern economy and in many ways the nation's economy. And so I would point this out. If you didn't pick this up in the reading, definitely be sure to. Question that I have about what role did cotton have in Southern overconfidence in case of a civil war? Well, you can just look at this and understand that the South felt confident that if a war broke out with the North, that the English would side with the South. They felt like the English economy was dependent on the Southern economy and not the Northern. This proves to be an error. When we get to the Civil War, the English did not side with the Southerners, with the Confederacy. So that's going to be a mistake. Another major error is they assume there won't be a Civil War because the North has too much dependency on their cotton, and the Southerners owe them a lot of money. Why on earth would they fight and not get their money or their cotton? So, and I guess there's another reason, if you want to write a third reason. There will be a terrible economic crisis right before the Civil War. It's called the Panic of 1857. And the South will kind of ride it out. The South won't really suffer terribly during that economic crisis, and the North will. It's an industrial depression. It's an industrial crisis. And so they're going to feel like the North cannot risk losing or alienating Southern agriculture, Southern economy, Southern cotton in a civil war, because it will lead to an economic collapse. So they feel like their economy is more stable than the Northern economy, which is just a terrible mistake, but one that they believe. So be aware that this pride and arrogance and Southern cotton supremacy is going to bleed into lots of other aspects of their life. Okay, so moving forward. This is, again, I want to make this point to you. If you look at the largest statistic percentage of investment of capital, this is invested in textiles based on cotton. So New England is utterly invested heavily in cotton textile looms. So if they don't get their textiles from their cotton from the South, then they're going to have to buy it from the Brits or something, who doesn't have any to spare. So as you can imagine, it is a real sense of codependency, we might say. And so I want really to hammer this point home to you, is that Northerners by nature were not abolitionists. There is I think a sort of preeminent belief that the North just wanted to end slavery because it was immoral. And the answer is no. The North, by and large, was ignorant of slavery. They didn't care. They didn't want to know about slavery because their jobs, their livelihood, their industry was based on the produce of what the slaves produced. So they didn't want to hear about that and see it. And they sure as heck didn't want to disrupt it. So it will take a radical shift in the mindset of some Northerners. But just like many of you made the mistake of arguing the American Revolution was a majority movement, which is inaccurate, not a true statement, abolitionism is a tiny minority movement. Do you understand? It's a very few people. And so the thought that like New Yorkers or Pennsylvanians are walking around just all fired up to end slavery would be utterly inaccurate. And I hope you don't think that way. Very, very few people felt that way outside of slaves and a handful of abolitionists. So here's another way to remember: over half of all American exports, half of everything we sold as a nation was cotton. So you can see how the people who were involved in this would be extraordinarily rich, fabulously wealthy. Okay, so much so that they became dominant over the society of the Deep South. So again, I use the word antebellum because it means before the war. And before the war, there was an almost unique culture that emerged here in the Deep South. Well, not here, but in the Deep South. We're not really in the Deep South at all. And it has to do with a very elite group of people. So let's go ahead and talk first of all about the misconception about slave ownership. This is one of the biggest areas of misconception most Americans seem to have about the South. First of all, just look at this, okay? 3/4 of all Southern whites owned 0 slaves. So I really need you to let that sink in, because while there's this sentiment that Northerners must have been running around being abolitionists and then Southerners must have been running around being slaveholders, both of those are incorrect. All right, 3/4 of Southern whites own no slaves. Okay. Now, the highest percentage of slave owners out of these groups were perhaps the yeoman farmer with less than 10. So the super fabulously wealthy is the 1/10 of 1%. Okay, see this? 1/10 of 1%. Now, those folks owned the bulk of slaves. So you think about that. 1/10 of 1% were the large slave owners. Well, I should say I guess the better way to put it is, I don't mean it that way. Per capita, they own the bulk of slaves. But in reality, if you look here, if you take this 24%, okay, half of that 24% own 4 or less. So that's not that many slaves being owned by most of the slave owners, if that makes sense. So if you look at the 50 or more slaves, that's these two categories here. So just very small numbers. All right. So we're talking about a very elite group of people. If you own 10 or more slaves, you were very wealthy, you know. So this number here would be what we might consider today in the South the upper middle class, the upper yeomanry, perhaps, if you own 1 to 4. Often you would find these folks working side by side with their slaves. But really, it's this number here that is the top 1% that were, you know, the oligarchy, the leadership of society. So here's another way to look at it. There were a total of 1,700 families that owned 100 or more slaves. So they're the elites, if you want to think of that in terms of economics. They're the old FFVs. You know, they owned. When someone owned 300 slaves, that's just a colossal value in capital. And so this should tell you something, that those folks did not want to see this ended, because this is where all their money is. While a Northerner might have put a lot of their money in a factory or in warehousing or in shipping on a boat, this is land and people. That's where all the money invested in the South was, in slaves and people. And just again, to give you what an oligarchy looks like, I'm going to end the PowerPoint for a moment and show you something different, which will give you, I think, a sense of perspective about who the slave owners also were. So this is something I created a while ago, but these are key business and political officials pre-Civil War, right up to the Civil War, who were major slave owners. And so if I just, for example, type in a Control F here for governors. So let's look for some governors. All right. So we got the governor. Here's a governor of Illinois, governor of Georgia, another governor of Illinois, another governor of Georgia, another governor of Georgia, governor of Wisconsin, another governor of Georgia. It's another governor, another governor of Texas. That's Sam Houston, South Carolina. And I left some of the bigger names like Thomas Jefferson off of here, I believe. But here's another governor. So do you understand? Senators, congressmen, Supreme Court justices. Here's the Chief Justice, vice presidents, presidents. So I can't in any way convince people of how rare it was for Southern whites to own slaves, but how important it was for the elites to own slaves. You see this? Here's a fella who owned 450 slaves with a dozen plantations. So, when we talk about an oligarchy, when I say oligarchy, that's the oligarchy. The condition for wealth in the South was a plantation owner of a large number of slaves. That was their society. So when I talk about the Civil War as being a poor man's fight, it's a rich man's war, meaning those are the people who started. That's the Confederacy. A lot of what you just saw there were the Confederates. Most of the boys who fought in the Civil War never once owned a slave or dreamed of owning a slave. They were poor. but that was their government, and their government told them, you need to defend your home. So they're fighting because their leadership class, their elites, are telling them that's what they're supposed to do. And that somehow seems forgotten in this narrative. Of course, they were fighting for what they were told to do. And of course, the elites were fighting to keep slaves. That's the whole point. So yes, this is what a typical wealthy planter's house could look like. Well, maybe not typical, but a really extravagant landowner. This is Edward Lloyd V. He owned 42,000 acres with 1,000 slaves. So, you know, here in our neck of the wood, we had a family called the Harstons, who were Scottish immigrants, who owned something like 16,000 acres and over 200 slaves. And of course, the legacy of their family is still very present here in Pennsylvania County and Henry County. So massive estates, just huge estates. It's very fascinating to study the size of it. I showed you the other officials who owned slaves. Here are your presidents who are slave owners. And so you can see, obviously, the Virginia dynasty, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Jackson, Carolina, Harrison. So big numbers, big numbers of slave ownership here. And they came from the most wealthy elites. And so what emerges in their mind, which is, I've always looked at it and called it a sham, but it wasn't a sham to them. In their mind, it was very real. And this is a sort of Gone with the Wind. If you know that sort of epic tale, the film was made in 1939. The book was written a few years prior to that. This is the story of the South as it was being destroyed by the Civil War, and how it was this great planter elites who were honorable and decent and good people who were, you know, defeated by the industrial menace of the evil Yankees. Well, out of that comes the idea of the belle of the ball. The state sport of Maryland to this day is jousting. So it's this idea of chivalry, this idea of knights from medieval times. A very common behavior, as we've already discussed in America, was dueling. You know, the dueling over honor and having your honor defended or insulted. You would see these large Georgian estates with the massive pillars. And, you know, today, I saw the other day, I forget who it was, got married. I forget who it was, a movie star, but he and his wife, Ryan Reynolds, that's who it was. He and his wife had gotten married in a South Carolina plantation. And people are like, you know, that's kind of not really, and he apologized for it later. Like he said, you know, I didn't really think about what made this plantation a plantation was the legacy of slavery. But nonetheless, these plantations are still very, very, the locations are still present. If you go down to South Carolina or Georgia, you can still tour these places, so to speak. Of course, Monticello is a plantation as well. And here you have an idea of one way, and I've shown you colonial era plantations already. Not far removed from them. Usually, it would be located on some body of water, so you could ship goods. Usually self-sustaining, and by that I mean they would grow the food for the people there on location, you know, on supply there. So here you have a rice farm plantation, corn being grown here, sugar cane, and of course cotton. And then, you know, you would have the planter's estate, the large planter's mansion, and then you would have you know, slave quarters. That's what all these little green boxes are here, would be where the slaves would live. And, you know, so what a lot of these plantations are doing now, I think Monticello most notably, is trying to recreate, if not preserve, Madison's Montpelier's done it too, the slave experience, so to speak, in terms of the homes, the slave quarters, what it was like to live there as an African American too. Keep in mind, a whole lot more people lived on these plantations as slaves than they did as planters. I mean, the majority of the people on these plantations would be enslaved people, not wealthy white people. So here's a photograph of a slave family. You can see sort of the last relics of that lithograph or photograph. Another example of a southern cabin, and this would be sometimes later in history, we'd call these shotgun shacks. 3 or 4 people would live in here at least. One room, no heat, you know, just absolute poverty, the lowest level of comfort you can possibly have, short of being outdoors. In the background, you can kind of see the estate. So these would be really small. Most of the time, people would eat outside. The meals would be prepared in an outside building like this and then carried into the plantation. So, where does this chivalry idea come from? Well, last chapter we were reading about the Transcendentalists. I hope you guys read about that. What's interesting, at the same time in England, you had a group of writers called the Romantics. And the Romantics tended to look at like society and romanticize it, meaning turn it into a story that's not necessarily realism. Charles Dickens was a realist. He reacted against guys like Sir Walter Scott. But Scott was a Scotsman, as you might imagine, and he wrote knights of old England. He wrote about old English knights, and he wrote about like Arthur and stuff like that in a very chivalric manner. So in other words, if you actually go back in time to when medieval feudalism existed, this would not be a period where you would really want to live. It was not romantic. It was dirty and smelly and cold and very few amenities. But he made it seem very glamorous and very exciting. And his influence, I don't want to overstate it, but it certainly helped influence the idea of chivalry. And so when you look at something like the Civil War, you have a lot of Southerners who feel like they are honor bound. And honor is a very important idea to them, and very honor bound to fight on behalf of their country, as they called it. And their country would be their state or their community or their plantation. So, when they're defending the honor of Virginia, that's Robert E. Lee, who was certainly one of those large scale planters. He felt duty bound to defend his home against an invader, even if that invader happened to be his nation, which was an idea that was still sort of nebulous for quite a few of these guys. But anyway, please know Sir Walter Scott and the influence of his sort of fantasy of medieval chivalry and the influence that had. And I don't want to leave out the ladies, because what we often overlook is there's this sort of distorted version of the cult of domesticity. So if you were a Southern mistress, that means like a planter's wife, it was your job, so to speak, to mind the home, just like a Northern woman would, in terms of the cult of domesticity. The only difference is there was a new dynamic that was not necessarily normal for a Northern woman, and that was to discipline the slaves that worked in the house, in the plantation. So here's a quote from a story about Maria. She was a 13-year-old house servant. So keep in mind, you definitely had a division of labor between domestic servants, like people who worked in the houses, and field laborers, people who worked on the plantation land. So one day, receiving no response, the mistress began searching for her. Finally, she opened the parlor, and there was a child with her master. Okay, her master meaning this woman's husband. The master ran out of the room, mounted his horse, and rode off to escape. Though well, he knew that his wife's full fury would fall upon the young head of his victim. So, in other words, this slave master was assaulting this teenage girl sexually. The mistress, for this, beat the child and locked her up in a smokehouse. For 2 weeks, the girl was constantly whipped. Some of the elderly servants attempted to plead with the mistress on her behalf and even hinted that it was the master that was to blame. The mistress' reply was typical: "She'll know better in the future. After I've done with her, she'll never do that again through ignorance." So I have a DVD that I try to show to students. This year has been a bust on that, but it's called 12 Years a Slave. And it really very much reenacts this narrative, this event. And so an unfortunately routinely common event in Southern slave life was the sexual assault of slaves by their master. And of course, the utter disregard for the, I guess, feelings wouldn't even begin to be the word, but for the sanity of the slaves in the home. This would be the kind of treatment you would see. Really terrible stuff. Again, the idea of the chivalric woman, sweet sister, stoop not to be a man. So Southern women, unlike Northern women, are not going to have a large-scale feminist movement. So they're not going to be Susan B. Anthony's very much of the South. They're not going to be Elizabeth Cady Stanton's hardly at all. A Southern woman was very familiar to know her place. Man has his place as woman hers, and she is made to comfort, minister, and help. So the idea is that, you know, a woman is in the home and is to be obedient, and that gender role was normal North and South. The difference was in the South, they weren't confronted with economic opportunities. So if you may recall, you know, if you think about like the Lowell mills, those are young women who worked, and so they had a sense of making money, you know, and what that meant. Now, again, most of them culturally wanted to get married and have children, and that would be the end of it. But there isn't really a strong second great awakening on the plantation either. You guys remember the historic religious event? That's not a plantation event. You don't see that impact the women of the plantation very much. So these 1,700 or so odd people were elites, but they were also like islands almost to themselves. So if you owned, you know, 4,000 acres, you were very much not with a neighbor. So your entire plantation was your community. And I need you to understand, if you've been paying attention to this, particularly this, and this happens routinely, and the only people you're around are your slaves, then you might be able to figure out what emotion governed a lot of slave owners. What emotion would be there? Yeah, interesting. How about fear? Fear, because if you're not careful, mightn't this girl cut your throat in the middle of the night? And certainly fear of insurrection. See, you've got 400 slaves on your plantation, you have 6 white people or 8 white people. So what you have is this very bizarre relationship emerge where wealthy elite Southern whites are both terrorizing their slaves, but also terrified of them. And that creates a huge sense of hostility between them. And that's an unfortunate event, you know, because that means you are never going to consider the idea of ending slavery. Because what might these people do to you if they end slavery? Well, might get revenge. So I would definitely be aware of that. So what's wrong with slavery beyond the obvious immoral element of it? So if you noticed, it led to, again, land butchery. I showed you how basically the Southwest filled up in 40 years, excuse me. You know, more or less filled up, thousands and thousands of acres consumed. It was monopolistic. If you were a poor white person, you couldn't afford land in this deep South. Unless you were like a tenant farmer or perhaps a squatter. It was very, very hard to be, you know, on your own in the South and make amends out of it. Your livelihood was invested in things, i.e., people that could run away. You know, if you spent $300 on a human who ran away, then that money wasn't coming back. It wasn't insured for that. And of course, it also meant, number 4 there, you were routinely chained to a single cash crop. If you only have one skill as a future student, you're going to need to be really, really good at that skill and better hope it's in demand, because if you're not diversified, the economy tends to leave you behind. That's certainly what happened. The South began looking at how the North was doing and realized that, well, yeah, 1,700 peoples or 1,700 families were doing pretty well in the Deep South, but everyone else was struggling. Meanwhile, that middle class was booming in the North. There's no real middle class in the South. I mean, it's some, but not much. And one of the reasons for that is there's no industry in the South. And one of the reasons for that is you don't use slaves in a factory. So the factory didn't develop in the South hardly at all. And so because of that, if I'm an immigrant, if I'm an Irishman, now I will say this about the Irish. The Irish did occasionally come down south to get work, because no slaveholder would be stupid enough to put their slave in one of the most dangerous jobs they had. But they're going to be like using something like blowing stuff up or something that was high risk. You didn't use your slave to do that because that might kill them. You used an Irishman because they were expendable. But nonetheless, the Irish, the Germans, the Pennsylvania, they didn't come to the South. No reason to. They weren't going to get work. So rarely did you see economic growth in the South outside of a handful of people. Okay. Now, another thing I would mention that the book talks about, which is not in this list, but I would add it, certainly is like a coda. The South was basically the last place in the West to have slavery in Western civilization. So in other words, like everywhere else in the world that was sort of developed had gotten rid of slavery. Okay, and the South hadn't. So that made them sort of, again, behind not only the North, but behind everywhere else. I pointed out that it was less efficient. Obviously, the amount of money you had to spend on slave catchers. That was, by the way, a cottage industry, an industry down south that did actually have some success for middle class, if you want to look working class white man, is that you might not be able to own slaves, but you sure as heck could be on a runaway like slave catching crew. So they would hunt them, slave catchers, but they would charge a pretty penny, these slave patrols. Okay. And if you had to penalize your slave by cutting off their toe or putting them in shackles, well, that cut into their profit. And so they also outlawed literacy completely. It was illegal to educate an African American. It was illegal for a black person to learn to read or write. In fact, whites would be on, like, they would often be attentive to see if there were clues that their slaves could do this. They could not be out after dark. They had to have passes that allowed them to go to like stores and stuff. Just really terrible treatment of these folks. Okay. So just to kind of again, a summary here. South overwhelmingly agrarian. There's one iron mine, I think, major iron mine in Alabama. There's one iron works here in Virginia, Tredegar, which means they didn't make hardly any metal work stuff at all. Virtually no textile manufacturing at all. Now, I want to point out this number 2 here, a change of this South, is that if you consider Thomas Jefferson is from the upper South, okay? Jefferson Davis is from Mississippi, the lower South. And so what happens is when our country starts, Virginia is the most powerful state. But over time, the strength of the Southern planter class, deep South planter class, becomes more dominant. So you'll start to see a reduction in Virginia by the 1830s and 40s, and really a rise in Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia. They'll become much more dominant in American political discussion. South Carolina. We've talked about the role of cotton, the lack of industry. Rudimentary means, very crude, very little banking in the South. Thomas Jefferson writes about a Southern farmer being in hock to a Northern banker, and that was very common. So it would not have been unusual for Southerners to owe money to Northerners, which was another reason for their resentment. And then, they didn't build hardly any railroads at all to speak of. So let's get into the last part of today, and that is society in the South. So I like you to, I've updated this a little bit, maybe from the last time you looked at it, but so try to keep in mind that America's population was about 31 million, 31.5 million. So almost half the nation's population, a little under half, was in the South. But of that number, almost 4 million. So if you think about it, that's what 12% of the population were slaves of the American population. So almost a third of the entire Southern population were slaves. Why do you think they wanted the 3/5 compromise so bad? But you'll see here and here and here are who Southerners were. So probably your ancestors were probably in this group if you're a Virginian who is white. Probably. You were probably in the 5.3 million plain folk who owned no slaves at all. Maybe, yours would have been in the 1 to 9 slave owners, okay, which was unlikely in this part of our state, but possible. And it's highly unlikely that you would have been one of the 5,000 slaveocracy, so to speak. So if you're writing down the Southern hierarchy, at the top are those 1,700 families, which constituted about 5,000 people. So these are the elites. These are the governors and publishers of newspapers and senators and vast estate owners. Okay. Then you had two different groups here, and one are these small scale slave owners who are a form of like upper middle class, maybe you might go so far as to call that. And then the other plain folk would have been non-slaveholding yeomanry. And then I don't personally like these terms, but these are the historic terms that have been associated for lots of folks over the history. I have a 400-year history of white trash, and that is the poor whites who did not own land and probably were renting or squatting. Hillbillies would be the people in the mountain counties. So I think West Virginia here, maybe Floyd County, areas west of there. And then you had a very small population of free black people who were sort of like really unwelcome in general, but I'll explain them a little bit more in a minute. And then, of course, at the bottom of the hierarchy are slaves. So again, most people would have fallen here, most white people, excuse me. This would have been 7 million, and here would have been close to 4 million. So, the vast majority would be either slaves or these folks, all right? And then a handful of people here. So be sure you're familiar with this because it's in many ways a similar distinction from the North, the Industrial Revolution. You had the multimillionaire factory owners up here, and then you had the small business owners over here, and then you had the middle class, kind of working class people over here that weren't terribly poor. So let's look at each group a little bit closer. And I want to start with the yeomanry, since that's the most people. This is the yeomanry, usually owned somewhere between 40 and 100 acres, maybe, if that, sometimes less, but usually about that. And I have a quote here from a Southerner who's writing about our yeomanry. Now, keep in mind, the word yeoman might be relatively new to you, but you shouldn't be. It's a working class on a farm. You have no yeoman in the South. By the way, the italics is rhetorical. Beg your pardon, our dear sir. We have hosts of them. I thought you only had poor white trash. Yes, we dare say as much, and that the moon is made of green cheese. Know then that the poor whites of the South are a separate class to themselves. Now, this is a Southerner talking about Southerners. The Southern yeomen are as distinct from them as the Southern gentleman is from the cotton snob. Certainly the Southern, by the way, that's, a guy who trades cotton as opposed to a man who has a plantation. All right. Certainly the Southern yeomen are nearly always poor, at least so far as the world's goods are to be taken into account. As a general thing, they own no slaves, and even in case they do, the wealthy of this rarely possess more than 10 to 15. The Southern yeoman much resembles in his speech, religious beliefs, household arrangements, indoor sports. Indoor sports would be like card playing or board games. Family traditions, middle-class farmers of the northern states. So if you think about Pennsylvania, if you think about New York, if you think about Illinois, they're the same people, this guy's saying. He is fully as intelligent and is on the whole much better versed in politics of our federal and state constitutions, although not as a class pecuniarily, meaning they don't have money invested in slave property, not as a class interested in slave property. They're almost unanimously pro-slavery in sentiment, nor do we see how any honest, thoughtful person can reasonably find fault with them on this. So these guys do not like African Americans, and they are pro-slavery, and who can blame them, says this guy. So that's going to raise a really interesting question. Why then are these folks, not these folks, why are these folks, excuse me, why are they such defenders of slavery? Why are people who probably will never own slaves, why do they defend it so much?
That's the only thing that makes them above blacks on the hierarchy.
Okay, so there's a social element to it, absolutely. The idea that, and this goes back to what we were talking about with Bacon's Rebellion, the idea that, you have this white class that at least we're not black people, at least we're not black slaves. There is a sort of myth that seems to have emerged somewhere along the way that I hear students say from time to time, and that is they thought they too would one day own slaves. I have not read that. I have never come across any real data to say that these people, had an ambition of one day being slave owners themselves with any sort of consistency. In other words, if you look at that 1700, the book says the carrot on the stick ever dangling was the hope of buying a slave or two. Now that's important to make a distinction of. They're not being ambitious to become these people. Why would they want a slave or two? It has more to do with this. Let me see if I can show you. It was a form of American small business that is an absolutely horrific. Okay. Now I totally agree with Nicholas on the theory of racial superiority. Like they don't want these African Americans. They wouldn't have used that term, but you understand. So I believe they saw this as an opportunity to make money. And so this is one of the most horrific elements of the American slave industry. And that is, let's say you had one African-American male, he was 24 years old, you would rent him out to other slave owners to impregnate their female slaves, and what became known as slave breeding. And this, this is just what it meant was you locked a male slave in a cabin with a female slave, and he raped her until she became pregnant. So that's the, one of the ways you might be able to move up a little bit. But typically, I think it is what you were saying, Nicholas, and that is this sense of racial superiority. Like, at least we're not a what word. So these are the folks that would be basically the backbone of the Southern economy and society, in terms of consumers and things like that. Now, poor whites, who again, often you see called poor white trash, would usually be very malnourished. In many places that it existed then, still exists now. And I hate to say it like that, but in Appalachia there were elements of this as well, mountain whites, but just very, very impoverished. And so these two groups would have had very little stake at all in slavery. In fact, they would have been racist as they were. And I have read these guys, right? I've never really read any writing of these so much as about these. But nonetheless, this is the Southern white society by and large. Now, I did mention there was 250,000 free blacks. And the example I like to use as why he was able to survive is Thomas Day. And I don't know if you guys know where Milton, North Carolina is, but not far from here. And Thomas Day was such a skilled carpenter that people left him alone and bought his goods. In other words, they bought his furniture. And as long as I'm putting quotes here, he knew his place, which meant to be quiet and working. So free blacks were rare for a couple of reasons, but usually if they survived in the South, it's because they had a distinctive skill that other people valued that they couldn't compete with. For example, people in the North Carolina area around Milton respected the nature of his work so much that they left him alone. This will, by the way, be Booker T. Washington's thesis on how to keep black people moving forward in society, is to make sure that they have skills so that they'll be, if you enter into economic transactions with people, after a while, you'll begin to think of them more as your equal. That was Booker T. Washington's theory. And honestly, Thomas Day gives him some credence to that. Okay. So again, free blacks existed. They were not common. The three ways that they most commonly did exist were if they were freed by their owner. That's called manumission. Now, if they were manumitted as a result of a war, and that certainly happened. So in other words, if you served in the Patriot Revolutionary cause for your master, he would free you. Or if you served in the War of 1812. President Washington freed his slaves on his death in his will. So that word freeing your slave is manumit or manumission. But the way that many students aren't aware of, that's one of the more interesting ones for me, is self-purchase. And so what this means is, and I've read quite a bit about this the last couple of years, slaves were allowed to make money in their free time. So for example, if you were a musician, you could rent yourself out to a neighbor and play music for him with your master's permission. And the masters usually allowed this because they usually got a piece of the money out of it. And then you could actually give the master the money for you. You could buy your own purchase. But I would emphasize that this is rare. And keep in mind, they were very, very much unliked in the North as well as the South. The folks who did not like black folks in the North did not want to compete with them for land or for territory or for, more importantly, jobs. So, often the people who hated blacks the most in the North were the Irish by far. But even frontiers type like Abraham Lincoln were no fan of African Americans as free people in that neighborhood because they didn't want to have like somebody else potentially buying the land they wanted to buy. So they had no civil rights. At any time, if they did not have documents, they could be captured. So it's a very hard life. I can't really imagine how hard it must have been. Now, there were a handful of places, and you might be able to deduce where that free blacks could live, most notably the burned over district. So if you think about the burned over district, quite a few free black people moved there. But most, if they moved out of the South, it was to Canada because just how hard it was everywhere. So anyway, we're going to wrap that up for today. Tomorrow we'll pick up with changes and policies towards slavery. And you should definitely read this section, second half of chapter 16 if you haven't done so. Stop that now.